Hey, Dallas. We have Well, hello and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another jam-packed, action-filled information overload coming the way just for you. And it looks like spring is finally about to really spring, as they actually have the air conditioner on in the studio. That's a good sign because it's cooling off in here, and instead of having to deal with the heat, we actually have comfort, but going in the opposite direction. It's not a bad thing. So this is the 19th of April. A lot of things have been happening lately. First of all, you have the anniversary of the first shots of the Revolutionary War at Lexington and Concord. And why did the British raid Lexington and Concord? Because they were going for the colonists' guns. That was a big driving force behind the Second Amendment. But we're not going to really get into that today. Barbara Bush, the former First Lady of the United States, she unfortunately passed away at the age of 92. R. Lee Ermey from Full Metal Jacket and Mail Call fame, he passed away. Harry Anderson from Night Court, he's gone. So this has been a bad week for celebrities, and those are three of my favorites, so I have to at least offer my condolences to their respective families. And then, of course, we have the Congress has filed a letter with the Justice Department calling for criminal charges against former FBI Director James Comey and Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. A lot of things happening that we're not going to cover today because we actually have something else that we're going to spend the rest of the program looking at. And that's going to actually have a lot to do with our Prager University segment today. Why did America fight the Korean War?
Mention the Korean War today and most people will look at you with a blank stare. At the time it was fought, just 5 years after World War II ended, everyone recognized it as a world-shaping conflict, a stark confrontation between the forces of democracy and communism. It began on June 25, 1950, when Soviet-backed Communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and invaded its U.S.-backed anti-communist South Korean neighbor. Within weeks, the communists had nearly absorbed the entire country. The United States at first was confused over whether it should or even could respond. America had slashed its military budget after the end of World War II and was short both men and equipment. It still had not awakened fully to the expansionist threat of Soviet Russia. The Soviets, buoyed by their own recent development of an atomic bomb and Mao Zedong's communist victory in China, sensed America's lack of resolve and encouraged the North's aggression. Yet within weeks, President Harry Truman rushed troops to save the shrinking Allied perimeter at Pusan on the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula. By late September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur had successfully completed the Incheon landings and launched counterattacks. He quickly reclaimed the entire South and sent American-led United Nations forces far into North Korea to reunite the entire peninsula, only to be surprised when hundreds of thousands of Chinese Red Army troops crossed the Yalu River at the Chinese border and sent the outnumbered Americans reeling back into South Korea. Thanks to the genius of General Matthew Ridgway, who arrived to assume supreme command in South Korea in December 1950, over the next 100 days, U.S.-led UN forces pushed the communists back across the 38th parallel. The fighting was fierce, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, exchanged hands between communist and U.S.-led forces 5 times before it was finally secured. During the years 1952 and 1953, the war grew static, neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Eventually, the conflict ended with a tense armistice in July 1953. For over the next 60 years, a Cold War persisted between the Stalinist North and what by the 1980s had evolved into the democratic economic powerhouse of South Korea. Over 35,000 Americans died in the Korean War. The war marked the first major armed conflict of the nuclear age, and one in which the United States had not clearly defeated the enemy and thus not dictated terms of surrender. Was fighting the Korean War and restoring the South without uniting the entire peninsula worth the huge cost in blood and treasure? The natural dividend of saving the South was the evolution of today's democratic and prosperous South Korea that has given its 50 million citizens undreamed of freedom and affluence, and has blessed the world with top-flight products from the likes of Hyundai, Kia, LG, and Samsung. South Korea is a model global citizen and a strong ally of the U.S., and stands in sharp contrast to the communist regime in the North that has starved and murdered millions of its own people and caused untold mischief in the world community. Had it not been for U.S. intervention and support to the South, the current monstrous regime in Pyongyang would now rule all of Korea, ensuring its nuclear-armed dictatorship even greater power and resources. The American effort to save South Korea also sent a message to both Communist China and the Soviet Union that the free world, under U.S. leadership, would no longer tolerate communist military takeovers of free nations. The resulting deterrence policy helped to keep the communist world from attempting similar surprise attacks on Japan, Taiwan, and Western Europe. Finally, the Korean War awakened the United States to the dangers of disarmament and isolationism and led to the bipartisan foreign policy of containment of global communism that in 1989 finally led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and with it victory in the Cold War. The Korean War was an incomplete American victory in its failure to liberate North Korea and unite the peninsula, but a victory nonetheless, and not just from a military perspective, but from a moral one as well. The reason 35,000 Americans died in Korea was to keep at least half the Korean people free. Korea did not have a single material resource that would have benefited America. The Korean War merits more than a blank stare. It deserves to be remembered and studied with pride. I'm Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution for Prager University.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel,
I've had the great fortune for many, many, many years to know a lot of Korean War veterans, and it's known as the Forgotten War because it kind of took place between World War II and Vietnam, which were much wider publicized events. And the service of Korean War veterans, is unblemished. And I think we need to hold them in as high esteem as we do the World War II generation. But the war in Korea may have ended as a hot war in 1953, but it was not the end of the war. It was an armistice that was signed, but it was not an actual codified terms of general surrender or an ending of the war. It could be resumed at any time. Just because the North and the South stopped shooting at each other, we've been patrolling that demilitarized zone now since 1953. The war is still there. We're still preparing. And so are the North Koreans. And so now we're going to take a quick look as to why North Korea hates the United States. Because they do.
The North Korean regime hates the United States. Every day, North Koreans are told that the Americans are imperialists, aggressors, and hostile. North Korean children are taught that cunning American wolves want to kill them. To understand where this hatred is coming from, we need to go back to the Korean War. After the U.S. and Soviet Union agreed to split the peninsula at the 38th parallel, Kim Il-sung was installed as the North's communist leader. In 1950, he tried to reunify the Koreas by force. The northern forces pushed down the peninsula, capturing Seoul.
A highly trained and well-equipped North Korean army swarmed across the 38th parallel to attack unprepared South Korean defenders. Caught off guard,
A surprise landing at Incheon by General Douglas MacArthur turned the tide of the war and cut off the North supply lines. The American-led UN forces moved deep into North Korea, capturing Pyongyang. But when the Chinese intervened, the fighting was pushed back to where it all began, the 38th parallel.
Chinese communist troops crossed the Manchurian border and helped the North Korean Reds drive back UN forces.
For the next 2.5 years, neither side made any headway. Most Americans have forgotten or never knew that the Korean War was a brutal one. It devastated the peninsula, and the North got the worst of it. The United States dropped 635,000 tons of bombs in Korea, compared with the 503,000 tons dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. U.S. bombers decimated the North. After bombing urban targets, the U.S. hit dams, flooding farmland. Air Force commanders complained that they'd run out of targets. This, in part, has fueled the North Korean narrative, helping keep the Kim family in power for almost 7 decades. From the very real events of the Korean War, North Korea's propagandists have created a version of history that is designed to keep the shock and horror alive. According to the North Korean version of events, the South, backed by their imperialist allies, started the conflict, which is painted as a patriotic war fought against American invaders. North Koreans know it as the victorious Fatherland Liberation War. The regime has used anti-Americanism as an ideological tool, keeping its citizens in constant fear of an imminent American attack. When tensions between North Korea and the U.S. escalate, the North turns up the volume on its propaganda machine. This helps it unify North Koreans against a supposed external threat. At the Sinchon Museum of American War Atrocities, the narrative of American aggression is kept alive. According to North Korean state media, a major expansion in July 2015 turned it into a center for anti-U.S. class education. The Korean Central News Agency reported in March that more than 18,000 people visited the museum in the first 10 days of the month. KCNA went on to say that the hearts of the visitors were burning with the resolution to punish the U.S. imperialists and the South Korean warmongers.
So now we wonder, why is it that we can't seem to break through the ice in diplomacy? Sure, we spent, 605,000 tons of bombs in the 1950s over the Korean Peninsula to check the communists, as we just discovered. But they have continued to use that as a propaganda machine against the United States. But we have continued to use our propaganda machine against the North Koreans. And so you wonder why there's no thaw, and of course, there's good reason behind it. So what we're actually going to take a look at now is, now that you understand a little bit about the Korean War and the push and pull in the 1950s, the way that the North Koreans have viewed the United States ever since, now let's take a look at North Korea as a nuclear threat. Because they are one of 9 countries that use nuclear weapons, and so they have to be taken seriously in that regard. So let's go to the video and look at the growing North Korean nuclear threat.
In the last year, North Korea has been launching a lot of missiles. They're all just tests, but they're meant to send a message. North Korea is armed and dangerous. They've demonstrated missiles that can destroy Seoul and Tokyo, hit U.S. bases in the Pacific, and now one that can reach Alaska.
U.S. officials have confirmed that overnight North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, capable of reaching Alaska.
Kim Jong-un called it a gift to the Trump administration.
This is the end goal, or at least towards the end goal, for North Korea.
It's called the Hwasong-14. It's the newest member of North Korea's arsenal and their first working intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. It's the kind of thing that the US and Russia have thousands of and had used as a threat against each other during the Cold War.
Hold at the ready, never less than 1,000 missiles.
North Korea has been working on one of its own for a while, and they now appear to have one. The North Koreans have had nuclear bombs since 2006, and they could certainly attack their neighbors, but they've had no real way to deliver them to a distant target. They could try and drop one from an airplane, but it would be likely shot down well before getting to the target. The The most effective way to use a nuclear bomb is to attach it to a missile. Different delivery systems determine how far the target can be. North Korea already has a huge arsenal of short and medium-range missiles, but it didn't have a working ICBM, which can hit a target up to 15,000 kilometers away because it's actually multiple missiles in one. Stacked on top of each other, each missile is used one by one to push the warhead into space. Then once it's over a target, this final section re-enters the atmosphere and detonates. This is a very hard thing to engineer, and tests of a previous long-range missile, the Taepodong-2, failed repeatedly. But on July 4, 2017, North Korea successfully tested an ICBM, called a Hwasong-14. It reached a distance of about 930 kilometers, flew for nearly 40 minutes, and successfully re-entered, splashing down in the Sea of Japan. This is a major milestone for North Korea. Analysts calculate that if North Korea wanted to use the Hwasong-14 in a real attack, they would launch it at a lower angle, giving it a range of more than 5,500 kilometers, putting Alaska well in range. But this still doesn't mean North Korea can nuke Alaska today. The Pentagon says that North Koreans cannot fit a nuclear bomb on the Hwasong-14 and have it reliably detonate. See, this is a relatively small ICBM, meaning it can't carry a very heavy nuclear bomb. In order for it to make it to Alaska, the North Koreans would have to figure out how to miniaturize the bomb. And there's no evidence the North Koreans can do this yet. But the Hwasong-14 test shows that North Korea is rapidly improving its ICBM technology, and that it's determined to build one, no matter who tries to stop them. So this raises the question, why is North Korea so dead set on building an ICBM? The North Koreans first got nuclear technology in the 1950s, when their ally, the Soviet Union, helped them build nuclear reactors for energy. At the same time, they were protected from their enemies, South Korea and the U.S., by the massive nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union. But in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that protection went away. So North Korean dictator Kim Jong-il took matters into his own hands and started using the nuclear reactors to make weapons. The US didn't want an aggressive rogue state to have nuclear weapons, so 3 consecutive US presidents all tried different tactics to get North Korea to stop. Clinton negotiated, Bush suspended negotiations and threatened them, and Obama simply tried to wait North Korea out. But every single plan failed to stop the nuclear program, and there's a reason for that. See, the Kim dynasty believes their only option for security is to have proven nuclear capabilities. They saw the US invade Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein because they thought he might have nukes. They also saw Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi negotiate with the US and give up his nuclear program, only to be killed by US-backed rebels. The Kim dynasty is determined not to be next. So they've gone on to build an arsenal of missiles for their nuclear bombs. The Nodong is functional today and has a range of 1,500 kilometers. And North Korea's Scud missiles are highly effective within 1,000 kilometers. This puts North Korea's main enemies, South Korea and Japan, within range, as well as the 62,000 US troops stationed there. In fact, North Korea wants to make that loud and clear, and it does so by successfully testing these short-range missiles a lot. The tests provide a chance for them to improve their missiles, but more importantly, they send a political message. South Korea and Japan wouldn't attack North Korea because they've seen the missiles that could devastate some of their largest cities. Also, they don't have nuclear weapons of their own. So what's keeping North Korea from attacking its enemies? The US is, which has promised to protect South Korea and Japan with the largest ICBM arsenal in the world. This puts North Korea at a disadvantage. It knows the US can obliterate it, but it can't reach the US just yet. This is why the US can safely cut off North Korean trade and enact other punishments. And this brings us back to why North Korea has been trying so hard to build an ICBM. It's what they need to tip the scales in their favor. Right now, North Korea can only attack US allies, but if it can successfully test any of these ICBMs, it would be the same as telling the US, if you nuke us, we'll nuke you. If the US knows North Korea can target an American city, it'll be less likely to come to the aid of South Korea or Japan. This would effectively break up the alliance that's designed to keep North Korea in check. But the implications of this would go far beyond the Korean Peninsula. Suddenly, in charge of their own protection, South Korea and Japan would potentially develop nuclear weapons of their own, something Donald Trump once said he would be fine with. This would trigger a process called nuclear proliferation, and it's exactly what the US has been trying to prevent since the Cold War. Right now there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons of their own, while 190 maintain a non-nuclear status because of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the success of a North Korean ICBM could change that. If South Korea and Japan start looking to change their nuclear status, it could encourage other countries to do the same. So experts are urging the US to take action now while it still can. President Trump is pressing China to help. See, China continues to trade and have a diplomatic relationship with North Korea, essentially keeping the regime alive. So if Trump can get China to leverage or cut off that support, North Korea might not have enough resources to keep pursuing an ICBM. But for now, as North Korea continues to test and parade missiles, tensions continue to rise. 3 U.S. presidents have said they'd prevent the North from building better nukes and missiles. 3 U.S. presidents have failed. At least for now, it looks like Donald Trump will be the 4th.
Now, I hope you noticed at the end of that video, it talks about the relationship between China and North Korea. And then people wonder why we have a trade war with China right now. It makes sense. Donald Trump came to power, when he came into office, the war in Korea has been going on for most of his lifetime. And Donald Trump's in the 70s. He was a wee boy when that 1953 armistice occurred. We've had the diplomacy, but nothing ever changes. Donald Trump is a pragmatic problem solver. We see that. So what has he done? First thing, he leaned on China. Right after he got inaugurated, he was leaning on China to start working a deal with North Korea. We're going to end the Korean War. And China didn't really do as much as Donald Trump wanted. Then, of course, came a lot of the rhetoric and the military demonstrations, throwing a carrier group off the shores of North Korea, and then demonstrating with B-52 aircraft patrols on a routine basis. And, you know, we're showing our might. We can do stuff. And then, of course, in order to help weaken the Kim Jong-un and his family and his government economically, you put in sanctions, and now you go after China and you start increasing the tariffs on China. Part of it's because we have been losing a trade war with China, but the other is to continue to apply more pressure on North Korea. That's part of the strategy. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet government isn't backing the North Koreans as you know, the government of Russia might still be backing, but it's not like it was back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Things changed in 1991. So without having the Soviet Union being a big backer, and by having a economic sanctions coupled with the trade issues with China, that weakens Kim Jong-un's economic position. So those are the bargaining chips that President Trump has been making for the last almost year and a half. And of course, things escalated even further 6 months ago. So here is President Trump at the United Nations making a speech about North Korea and a threat.
Now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. To put it simply, we meet at a time of both immense promise and great peril. It is entirely up to us whether we lift the world to new heights or let it fall into a valley of disrepair.
Now that was from September. Now, I know that particular clip also talked about Iran to a great extent, but if you look at what he said about North Korea, that we can totally destroy North Korea. But he also appealed to the United Nations that this is what the United Nations is for, to prevent that from happening. And so he threw it back into the UN's court, not legal court. Of course, North Korea responded. And we're going to actually go to Al Jazeera for the response from the North Korean government.
The North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho has just spoken at a hastily called media conference outside his hotel in New York. He said that U.S. President Donald Trump's words about North Korea over the weekend at the UN General Assembly were clearly a declaration of war, and that North Korea therefore has every right to take countermeasures. Let's go live to our diplomatic editor, James Bays, who's outside the hotel in New York. James, tell us more first about what the North Korean foreign minister said and how worried should we be about this statement?
Well, these were his parting comments as he was leaving the hotel and being driven by U.S. agents, because he gets U.S. security while he's here, to the airport, and then make his way back, we assume, through China and then back to North Korea. And they followed comments that he made to the UN General Assembly on Saturday, and he's gone further. He's taken it further in two ways. He says now that North Korea considers the comments from President Trump earlier in the week, it considers those comments now to be a declaration of war. He also referred to something that happened just before he spoke in the General Assembly on Saturday that he didn't refer to in his speech. Clearly now he's had instructions from Pyongyang, and that is that show of force that took place on Saturday with U.S. Bombers and fighter jets coming from Japan, bombers from Guam, that flew together up the eastern coast of North Korea, just in international waters, going further above the demilitarized zone than any U.S. aircraft have done this century. He said that if U.S. bombers, he didn't refer to the fighter jets, were to fly near North Korea, even in international waters, North Korea will shoot them down. So a real ramping up of the language from the North Korean foreign minister. His comments on Saturday were, I described them at the time, as a blistering attack. Well, he's gone even further now in these fresh comments that he's made before leaving New York. He addressed us here, got in his car, and then came back a second time and addressed us, just simply to tell us that all options remain on the table and under consideration of the supreme leadership of his country. Now, we know very well the supreme leadership is one man, Kim.
He talked about countermeasures, James. What options would the North Koreans, what countermeasures would they be considering right now?
Well, he's already mentioned one very publicly, and that's the idea of a new nuclear test, this time an atmospheric nuclear test. And that would be something that would be carried out in the Pacific. It's a very dangerous proposition. It could cause all sorts of pollution, radioactive winds. It would be a nuclear test like the ones you've seen from the 1950s, with a great big mushroom cloud, rather than what North Korea has done in the past, which have been underground, contained nuclear tests. So that's a dangerous proposition. He's already floated the prospect of that taking place.
And there you had it. That was, I think, kind of the peak as to what we were seeing between the United States and North Korea. Now, of course, I mentioned earlier, and they just mentioned in that piece about flying bombers along the coast of North Korea. And that is not propaganda, that is actually true, that we have flown bombers, B-52s, that have been around since the Korean War, to demonstrate in international waters off the coast of North Korea. And the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation came out, CBC, and they actually put together a good piece on the B-52. I have, in my Air Force career, I have been around B-52s. I knew some of the pilots and navigators. I've never flown on a B-52, but you know, they're still, despite their age, they're still impressive machines. So let's take a look at U.S. revised Cold War era planes to defend America.
All right, your airfield, where 3-3 is active right now.
These are busy times for America's nuclear force.
You do have a targeting pod, you are connect, you're clean exterior, you got forward, center, and aft rack.
While subs and siloed missiles are secretive, mammoth 8-engine B-52s are meant to be visible.
It's crew ready.
Okay.
As North Korea's threats grow bigger and more frequent, these bombers, nearly a half-century old and relics of the Cold War, have been refurbished and are increasingly flying 33 hours round trip from the U.S. to the Korean Peninsula, a knock at Pyongyang's front door.
What is the nuclear capability of an aircraft like this?
So in this case, for the B-52, we can carry up to 20 nuclear-capable missiles.
Colonel Kurt Shingella says the B-52 doesn't need to be stealthy when it reaches around the world.
We can declare that we're flying it, which has its own kind of deterrence message, right? If you look at someone and say, I'm going to punch you and there's nothing you can do about it, and then you swing, there's a psychological impact to that.
The bombers have now deployed to the region, to Guam, putting them even closer if needed. Though they still practice a rapid nuclear response, these are not like the worst days of the Cold War. Nuclear missiles aren't routinely kept on planes, but the air crews, many of whom are in their 20s, are vigilant over the return of a nuclear threat and practice for it. As gargantuan as the B-52 seems, inside the crew compartment is another story.
All right, here we have the offensive compartment. It's the only place where you can fully stand.
On transcontinental missions, 8 crew stuff into this tiny space.
All right. So as we climb up, here is the pilot compartment area and the defensive compartment area as well.
Jesus, tight.
It is tight.
This is a huge plane. Why is there only this much space for people?
Right, so when the B-52 was designed, not much thought was given to crew comfort. They wanted to load as many weapons as they could, so we sacrificed crew space and crew comfort for weapon loadout.
These are your eyes outside the jet, so you can see actually what you're targeting at.
In the windowless weapons zone, it can be surreal to see what would be the last step before a nuclear attack.
So this is the switch that unlocks the weapons. To actually pick off the weapon is this manual launch button. There's 2 modes, there's a manual and an auto, but for the most part we use the manual launch to launch the weapon.
And Captain Layla Grenser has pressed it in practice runs for nuclear and most recently over Iraq and Syria with conventional bombs.
What's that like?
It's pretty exciting, honestly, when you get to see the big explosion go boom.
Up one level, the pilots, in the event of a nuclear war, they and everyone on board must consent to drop a weapon.
It's a little bit sobering at times when you start thinking about some of the things that you could be asked to go do. We just hope that our deterrence is enough to prevent any kind of nuclear war in that capacity.
This makes 23 missiles launched in 16 tests.
North Korea is working on an advanced version of this intercontinental ballistic missile.
North Korea certainly poses the greatest threat.
But the North Korea threat has given new nuclear life to the aging B-52, still the largest the U.S. has when it comes to dropping bombs. They go through the steps daily, loading weapons
and checking mock-ups of nuclear cruise missiles. Soon they'll be off toward the Korean peninsula again, and they want it known. A clear strategy of nuclear readiness that's been ramping up over the past few years. David Common, CBC News at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
So there you have it. We have been flying patrols against North Korea in international airspace, but it has been ratcheting things up. But then something happened. A couple months after that, something happened. And that was the 2018 Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games. Now, we have covered in previous episodes, which you can watch on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/NorthStarOasis, or our Facebook channel, facebook.com/NorthStarOasis. We covered a little bit about the thaw in relations with the Koreans during our Olympics coverage back in February. And so now we're going to take a quick look here at the beginning of that thaw. I mean, notice here, Trump takes office, applies pressure on China, increases military alertness and readiness, puts a carrier battle group, flies missions, has rhetoric about, my button's bigger than yours. Kim Jong-un does not know how to handle that. Kim Jong-un has been harmed economically. He also doesn't have much of a lifeline left with international partners. So now he really has no choice because he is in an inferior bargaining position. Trump is all about the negotiation. It's all he's been about. And he even made statements on the campaign trail about ending the conflict in North Korea. And we're seeing his form of diplomacy. So now in February, there was a historic handshake at the Pyeongchang Olympics. And let's take a look at what happened.
A step towards reconciliation. For the first time since the Korean War more than half a century ago, a member of North Korea's ruling family is welcomed in the South. The arrival of leader Kim Jong-un's sister is fascinating many South Koreans. Kim Yo-jong has quickly become a power broker. In another historic moment, South Korean President Moon Jae-in greeted her at the opening ceremony. Before, she sat near U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. The two didn't appear to exchange greetings. Then, the moment many had been waiting for. North and South Korean athletes marched under a unified flag as a celebration of ethnic nationalism. It's the first time they've done that at an international sporting event in 11 years. Moon said the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics offer a meaningful opportunity for a world divided by conflicts to unite. Critics say the North Korean charm offensive is only intended to advance its agenda.
North Koreans decided to look nice for a while on the assumption it will reduce chances that President Trump will authorize a military operation. But the problem is that major fundamentals have not changed. North Koreans are determined to have ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, capable of delivering a nuclear strike to the continental United States.
In the run-up to the Games, the North Koreans have absorbed much of the spotlight, first by agreeing to participate, and then by sending a high-level delegation to the South. This week, American diplomats said they would soon unveil the toughest economic sanctions against North Korea yet, while also saying a diplomatic solution was the focus. For now, this is a moment for South Koreans to show the world what a dynamic country they live in. During the opening ceremony, spectators were taken back in time to show the history of the Korean people and what organizers called their relentless pursuit of peace.
I hope that with North Korean athletes' participation, this could be Peace Olympics, and I hope we can achieve reunification between the South and the North.
The mood here is good. South Korea is hosting the Olympics and athletes are coming from around the world. It's a good opportunity to promote South Korea.
And the hope is this will set the stage not only for a sporting spectacular, but a historic breakthrough with their northern neighbors. Natasha Ganem, Al Jazeera, Gangneung, South Korea.
Well, that did become a historic breakthrough with their northern neighbors because 1 month later, March 8th, it was announced that the South Koreans and the North Koreans had been talking, and that Kim Jong-un has agreed to meet with President Trump. And he was ready to talk about denuclearization. So we're going to take a look at an RT. This is Russian television. We're going to take a look at an RT piece about the announcement of that historic meeting.
Well, President Trump has agreed to meet the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders has just confirmed the plans, tweeting that it will happen at a time and place to be determined. Well, the surprise announcement was made earlier by South Korea's national security advisor, speaking after talks in the White House.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un said he is committed to denuclearization, and he expressed his eagerness to meet President Trump as soon as possible. President Trump appreciated the briefing and said he would meet Kim Jong-un by May to achieve permanent denuclearization.
Well, for more on this, we can now cross live to RT's Caleb Morpin in New York. Well, hi there, Caleb. I mean, just recently there was talk of all-out nuclear war, and now this dramatic turnaround. I mean, could you bring us the latest?
Yes. Now, we heard it from the South Korean delegation to the White House. That was the National Security Director of South Korea who made the initial announcement. And now we have confirmation from the White House press secretary. It appears that at an unannounced and to-be-determined time and place, apparently it is going to take place before May, that's what we're hearing, before May, there will be a meeting between the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, located in the northern part of the peninsula, and U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, this is quite unprecedented. There has not been a meeting between a U.S. head of state and the leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It simply hasn't happened. And especially in light of recent events, as we've seen, you know, some rather heated words exchanged between the two leaders. This is what we've seen between Trump and the man he will soon be meeting. This is what we heard.
No, I don't think so. The era of strategic patience with the North Korean regime has failed. North Korea does not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury.
The U.S. neglects the international community's will to establish peace on the Korean Peninsula.
And we can't have madmen out there shooting rockets all over the place. You will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself.
No one other than Trump himself is on a suicide mission.
He is a sick puppy.
Now, we also understand that at this time, North Korea will not be engaging in any more ballistic missile tests or tests of its nuclear weapons. And at this point, it's quite an interesting development. Now, in the past, we've heard from the United States that the only condition in which they would talk to North Korea is if North Korea were to completely give up its nuclear arsenal. Now, we haven't heard any such offer from North Korea, but it appears that not only will talks resume, but that the head of state of the United States will actually meet with the head of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Korean Workers' Party, Kim Jong-un, the third-generation leader of that country. So a lot of surprise, not what people were expecting. One of the often observed things about Donald Trump is his unpredictability, and this is a move that many are saying was definitely not predicted.
Yeah, it could be history in the making. Caleb Morpin in New York, thank you very much. Thank you.
North Korea's.
So history in the making. This is not predicted. Well, I kind of predicted something similar to this. I'm sorry, but if you've been watching the show for any great length of time, for the last, 2 years, I've been discussing, almost 2 years, President Trump's ability to negotiate and the way he acts and, what he does. And he's usually 2 to 3 or 4 steps ahead of everybody else. So now that was last month. Now, what happened this last week? CIA Director Mike Pompeo actually met with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang. Now, Pompeo is now getting castigated because he is President Trump's nominee to replace Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State, and the Democrats in the Senate are grilling him over this, and some are threatening to not support him, largely, I think, because of going to North Korea to negotiate a settlement. So that I have to ask the question: what is the Democratic Party's priority? Scoring political points or improving diplomatic relations and trying to end a long-standing war with another country? And my producer, Dallas, just mentioned that Pompeo is already doing the job that he's been nominated for. And that's a very valid point. So I find it funny to see the Democrats playing politics with Pompeo when Pompeo is doing his job as both Director of CIA and as the future Secretary of State to try to set up this meeting between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And something else happened just the other day. What that was North and South Korea are actually discussing a formal end to the Korean War. That's right. Remember what I said earlier in the show. The 1953 armistice was just an armistice. It was just a ceasefire. It was not a long and lasting peace agreement. And here, North and South Korea, with President Trump's blessing, are talking about ending the formal war. That, I think, is a positive and historic move that, if this does, I'm cautiously optimistic, I think will be a great thing for our future, for humanity. So let's take a look at what President Trump had to say about the Koreas discussing ending the war.
North Korea is coming along. South Korea is meeting and has plans to meet with North Korea to see if they can end the war, and they have my blessing on that. And they've been very generous that without us and without me in particular, I guess, you would have to say that they wouldn't be discussing anything, including the Olympics would have been a failure. Instead, it was a great success. They would have had a real problem. But as you know, North Korea participated in the Olympics, and it made it. Really, it was quite an Olympics. It was quite a success. That would not have happened. And they do have my blessing to discuss the end to the war. People don't realize the Korean War has not ended. It's going on right now, and they are discussing an end to the war. So, subject to a deal, they would certainly have my blessing, and they do have my blessing to discuss that. Japan and ourselves are locked, and we are very unified on the subject of North Korea. We will probably be, depending on the various meetings and conversations, we'll be having meetings with Kim Jong-un very soon. It'll be that'll be taking place probably in early June or a little before that.
So there you have it. The Korean War may finally be coming to an end. Of course, everything is subject to what that agreement will look like, and nobody really knows what that is. There's been talk about, oh, well, Kim Jong-un has always been disingenuous and everything benefits the North Koreans, and with previous presidents that may very well have been true. But on the other hand, we're not dealing with somebody who was like the previous presidents, and somebody that I think Kim Jong-un is actually taking pretty seriously. So exactly what that is going to transpire to for a formalized agreement, I have no idea. Will it reunify the Korean Peninsula, or will it just codify the existing borders? Nobody knows. There might be a little bit of a framework that the North and South Korean governments might know exactly what that is like. The general public doesn't know. The media sure doesn't know. Policy analysts, most of them don't even know either. But I think the thaw-in relations in the Korean Peninsula is a good thing. Bringing the conclusion of the war is also going to be a good thing. And I really hope that people give President Trump the credit that he deserves if this works, because he really does deserve a lot of credit. And we'll talk about the last couple of administrations briefly. President Obama pretty much just waited out Kim Jong-un. Didn't really do anything to negotiate a peace, but didn't really do anything to inflame things. It was a policy of containment. It's Kim Jong-un is doing whatever Kim Jong-un is doing. And for 8 years, there was really no action. President Bush was embroiled a lot in the wars with Iraq and Afghanistan. Tried to do some things with the North Korean government, but his focus was more on what happened after 9/11. And then Bill Clinton ended up pacifying the North Koreans and helped giving them access to some technology, again, as an appeasement measure, and really did nothing to back up a U.S. government policy there. And then, of course, you had George H.W. Bush. I'll just go a little bit beyond that. George H.W. Bush with the Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Reagan was in the Middle East, and he was also fighting the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The other presidents had the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Jimmy Carter had Iran. Last year we did a 8-part series on the history of the Middle East and how we got there. I encourage you to check that out. But between the Cold War and wars in the Middle East, North Korea has kind of been allowed to do its own thing. And Trump finally says we've had enough. So now, Trump has gone, according to one policy analyst, Trump has gone further with North Korea than any previous U.S. president. Let's take a look what the analyst has to say.
For more on this, we're joined tonight by Surab Gupta. He's a policy specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Surab, nice to have you with us. The president really praised Xi Jinping tonight and China. Give us the backstory on this.
I think Xi has played an important part in bringing North Korea to the table by way of the sanctions. And he has developed a very, very good rapport with President Xi. I'm talking President Trump. And the two need to stay close and consult with each other on the North Korea issue if it really is to be resolved.
I took note of that tonight because it wasn't long ago that President Trump said China needs to do more here by pushing North Korea. And then there's a meeting with Pompeo with Kim Jong-un. I mean, something's going on.
Oh, a lot is going on. A lot is going on, and it's very, very encouraging. In a week's time, we are going to have the North Korea-South Korea summit. They're going to make some remarkable strides out there in that meeting. Then almost certainly Trump is going to meet Kim. And another important point, after that, Xi Jinping has already confirmed he is going to go to Pyongyang. So after that Trump-Kim meeting, so a lot of things are happening.
What do you think is happening in North Korea? Because some world leaders, including Vladimir Putin, has been on record saying that he didn't think that Kim Jong-un would give up his nuclear program. Do you think things have changed? Because it seems like this is the bar. This is what has to happen for the United States to get to the table. What's going on here?
There's a lot of people have talked about that, at the end of the day, he's not going to give up his nuclear weapons, and opinions are divided. Most people think he will not. But the fact of the matter is that he already has what a nuclear weapon can do, which is called unacceptable damage to an American ally, which is by way of conventional artillery. He can trash Seoul. That allows him to have the same effect of a nuclear weapon. So the actual nuclear weapon he has is something he can bargain and leverage, frankly.
Have the sanctions had a lot to do with this? Have they really put so much pressure on his regime that he's had to move?
It's been an important contributor, but I will say, frankly, it has not been the decisive contributor. The decisive contributor has been the fact that we have a progressive, forward-looking administration in South Korea, which has teased Kim out into the sunshine and told him of the possibilities that exist. Because let me tell you what would happen if that same conservative administration had been in South Korea. Kim would have done his same, tested within this constricted schedule. He would have gone into his bunker. He would have just stayed out there, and he would have come out from time to time to make very strong threats. But he would not come to the table. So I think the real credit is is due there.
President Trump quite often has made the point that he's not afraid to strike North Korea. And of course, the sanctions have followed. It's made China and Russia pretty nervous. What do you think of this negotiating strategy? And the mainstream media in America right now continues to push the narrative that, oh, this is really a big chance, because if this meeting doesn't go well and Trump ends up leaving, then it's a big failure. How do you see it?
I think Trump deserves a lot of credit because, yes, through what is called kind of the madman theory, he did ensure that China would take a much more proactive stance against North Korea, and that has been a reason for coming to the table. Mm-hmm. But we also have to recognize, before he went into fire and fury and said all those harsh things, he had prior to that said that I'm willing to have a burger with Kim Jong-un. He had praised him, and he had gone further than any American president previously had in giving assurances.
And that's why I don't understand why they're framing it that if this meeting doesn't go well, it's a big failure. Nobody's ever met with him before. I mean, maybe that's why we've had problems with him, because the United States always sets the bar very high. Oh, your behavior is terrible, so we can't talk to you. Maybe that's when you need to talk to people.
That's when you need to talk to people, and too many people in the foreign policy establishment are vested in just a sanctions-only or sticks-only policy, not enough of a carrot, and I think that's why there is that mainstream view.
If you can't sit down with, if you sit down with North Korea, why can't you sit down with Syria? That's the next question, I think. Surab Gupta, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And there you have it. That's where we're sitting at currently. Exactly what the future is going to hold, nobody knows. There is no crystal ball in this, other than the fact that the U.S., the North Koreans, the South Koreans, probably the Japanese, even the Chinese may all sit together and actually hash this out. I hope it works. I really do. I am still cautiously optimistic, but I'm still optimistic nonetheless. Now, as we end the show today, we are going to take a look back to 1952, actually 1951, with Tennessee Waltz. And if you can go ahead and play the video, I'll just talk a little bit over it here. We're going to show you scenes that were shot by a soldier in the U.S. Army with Patty Page's #1 hit from 1951-1952. With my darling to the Tennessee waltz, what an old friend I happen to see. Can you move the bar off the computer? Thank you. And while they were dancing, my friend stole my sweetheart from me. I remember the night and the Tennessee waltz. Hey Dallas, now I know this is going to lead us. How much I have lost. Yes, I lost my little darling the night they were playing the beautiful Tennessee waltz. Dallas Pearson producer. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis. Reminding you, there's 249 shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week. I introduced her to my loved one, and while they were dancing, my friend stole my sweetheart from me. Remember the night
much I have lost. Yes, I lost my